This cocky millionaire thought he was the king of first class, until he met a quiet stranger who didn't seem to belong. He mocked him, belittled him, and had no idea he was picking a fight with one of the most respected men on the planet. But when the big reveal hit, his world flipped upside down. What happens when arrogance collides with true humility? And what did this mystery man say that left an entire plane in stunned silence? Stick around till the end, because this is a lesson in respect you won't want to miss. Chapter 1. The Man Who Didn't Belong. LAX was its usual chaotic mess, rich businessmen barking into AirPods, influencers posing near terminal windows, and exhausted travelers dragging overpriced luggage across the polished floors. Victor Harding barely noticed any of it. He had more important things to focus on, like getting through this airport without having to breathe the same air as coach passengers. Adjusting the cuff of his Tom Ford blazer, he scanned the first-class line, already annoyed at how slow it was moving. But then his eyes locked onto something that made him do a double take. A guy tall, lean, standing near the front, wearing the kind of outfit Victor wouldn't even wear to sleep. Faded jeans, scuffed sneakers, a hoodie that looked like it came from a clearance bin. The guy stood there, hands in his pockets, gazing at nothing in particular, like he wasn't aware of the world around him. Victor scoffed. "You gotta be kidding me." He leaned toward the businessman in front of him, a gray-haired Wall Street type with Hermes briefcase. "What do you think? Lost tourist or economy passenger trying his luck?" The man barely glanced up. "Either way, he doesn't belong here." Victor smirked, satisfied. Exactly his thoughts. Then the line moved, and hoodie guy handed over his ticket. The agent scanned it. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Reeves." Victor frowned. "Wait. Reeves?" Before he could put the pieces together, hoodie guy strolled through the priority entrance, casual as hell, like he owned the place. Victor's jaw tensed. No, this wasn't right. First class wasn't for people like that. It was for people like him, self-made, successful, the kind of guy who turned long-haul flights into networking opportunities over Dom Perignon. A minute later, Victor handed over his own ticket and stepped through the same doors. But now, something gnawed at him. He didn't like seeing people who didn't belong. And this guy? He definitely didn't belong. Inside the sleek, dimly lit first-class cabin, Victor adjusted his seat, 3B, a window spot with all the perks he was accustomed to. He barely had time to appreciate the legroom when he turned and saw him. Hoodie guy was right next to him. Seat 3A. Of course. Victor exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. He wasn't the type to let things go, especially when something felt off. "You lost, buddy," he said, forcing a polite smile. The man turned, his expression unreadable. "No, I think I'm exactly where I need to be." That voice. Low, calm. The kind that didn't try too hard to prove anything. Victor arched an eyebrow. Huh. Funny. Most people who fly first class actually look like they fly first class. The man just gave a small, amused nod, like he'd heard it all before. "Guess I missed the dress code memo." Victor chuckled. "Yeah, well, I'll be honest, man. You're kinda messing with the aesthetic here." He gestured around the cabin. "We've got a standard." The man turned slightly in his seat, looking at Victor for the first time, really looking at him. Not like a rival, not like competition, but with something stranger. A quiet patience. "Maybe your standard's the problem," he said simply. Victor laughed, but there was an edge to it now. He didn't like that answer. "All right, humor me," he said. "How'd you get in here? Last-minute upgrade? Friend at the airline?" "Nope." Victor nodded. "Fair enough. So, what do you do?" The man shrugged. "A little bit of everything." Victor smirked. That's usually code for not much. The man didn't react. Victor wasn't used to people not reacting. He leaned in slightly. "You work in film or something?" "Indie stuff." The man exhaled through his nose, like he almost found this funny. "Something like that." Victor grinned, feeling like he had him figured out. "Ah, got it. Background guy in commercials, maybe? Some Netflix extra work?" The man tilted his head. "You think people need to be in the spotlight to matter?" Victor rolled his eyes. "Look, don't get me wrong, dude. I respect the hustle. But first class? That's for people who made it. People who worked their asses off to get here. You know what I mean." The man took a sip of his water. "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." Something about that answer pissed Victor off more than it should have. He was about to press further, maybe throw in a backhanded comment about how real success came with the dress code, when the flight attendant arrived. "Can I offer you gentlemen some champagne before takeoff?" Victor nodded. "Absolutely. Bring me the best bottle you've got." The flight attendant turned to the man. "Just water, Thanks, he said. Victor blinked. The flight attendant smiled, moving off to fetch their drinks. Victor let out a short laugh. Just water? In first class? The man shrugged. Yeah, I like water. Victor shook his head. Man, I gotta say, you're not really selling me on the whole I belong here thing. The man's lips quirked up slightly. That's because I don't need to sell you on anything. Victor's champagne arrived. He lifted the crystal flute, watching the bubbles rise to the top. He took a long, satisfied sip, then glanced back at the man's glass of water. Nothing wrong with treating yourself every once in a while, Victor said. The man looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. I agree. And for some reason, that answer annoyed Victor more than if he'd argued. He didn't know who this guy was, but he sure as hell was going to find out. Chapter 2, When Money Talks, but the Wrong Guy Listens. Victor couldn't let it go. The way this guy sat there calm, collected, like first class was just another Tuesday, was getting under his skin. The fact that he didn't care about the luxury around him, that he wasn't trying to flaunt or impress anyone, made Victor itch. Because in his world, people with money showed they had money. That was the whole point. And yet, here was this guy, sitting next to him, dressed like a college dropout on his way to a job interview at a coffee shop. Victor took another sip of champagne, letting the crisp, expensive taste linger. All right, man, he said, setting his glass down. I gotta ask, what do you actually do? The guy, Reeves, apparently tilted his head slightly, like he was debating whether to answer. I do a little bit of everything, he said, the same nonchalant tone as before. Victor smirked. Yeah, you said that already. But what does that mean? Like, are we talking real estate? Stocks? Tech? Or something a little more creative? Keanu took a sip of his water. I guess you could say creative. Victor grinned. Ah, there it is. You're an artist. He made air quotes. That explains the wardrobe. Keanu exhaled a short laugh through his nose. Something like that. Victor leaned in. Let me guess. You write poetry and sell it online? Or are we talking one of those, I'm working on a screenplay kind of deals? Keanu just smiled. Not exactly. Victor shook his head. Man, you're hard to pin down. Keanu didn't respond, just gave a small, knowing nod. Victor leaned back in his seat. He didn't like not having an answer. He thrived on knowing exactly who he was dealing with. That was how he built his empire, reading people, figuring out their weaknesses, knowing where he stood in comparison. And this guy? He was impossible to read. You ever hear that phrase, dress for the job you want? Victor asked. Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. Yeah. Victor gestured at him. I don't think you got the memo. Keanu chuckled. Maybe I already have the job I want. Victor laughed. Come on, man. No way you're sitting in first class looking like that unless you won the lottery or you have some rich family bailing you out. Which one is it? Keanu's expression didn't change. Neither. Victor's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. So you're telling me you earned this seat? Keanu nodded. That's right. Victor studied him. The way he answered, calm, direct, no need to explain himself, was throwing him off. See, I don't buy that, Victor said. Because if you really earned it, you'd act like it. You'd appreciate it. You'd look the part. That's how success works, man. You work your ass off, you climb the ladder, and when you finally make it, you show it. Keanu took another sip of water. Or, he said, maybe success isn't about proving anything. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. That sounds like something people say when they don't have anything to prove. Keanu smiled slightly. Or when they don't need to prove anything. Victor scoffed. So what? You think you're better than all this? Better than luxury? He tapped the armrest. You're sitting in a 5-figure seat, man. That doesn't happen by accident. Whether you admit it or not, you care about money, just like the rest of us. Keanu's gaze was steady. I care about what money allows me to do, not what it says about me. Victor frowned. That's the same thing. Keanu shook his head. No, it's not. Victor let out a dry laugh. So let me get this straight. You have money, but you don't act like you have money. You fly first class, but you drink water instead of champagne. You have the means to be comfortable, to indulge, but instead, you, what? Just pretend none of it matters. Keanu shrugged. I don't pretend. I just don't need it. Victor couldn't help but laugh. Man, I gotta say. That's a wild take. Keanu smiled. Maybe. Victor glanced around the cabin, then back at Keanu. You know what I think? I think people like to pretend money doesn't matter until they don't have it. And the people who act like they're above all this? 9 times out of 10, They're just trying to convince themselves of that because deep down, they want it, but they can't have it. Keanu nodded, considering. Could be true for some people. Victor grinned, feeling like he'd finally scored a point. Exactly. That's the reality, man. People want comfort. They want luxury. And the ones who say they don't. He shook his head. They're either lying or broke. Keanu studied him for a moment. Then he set his water down. Or, he said quietly, they know something you don't. Victor froze. There was something about the way he said it. No arrogance. No smugness. Just a calm certainty, like he wasn't trying to win the conversation. He was just stating a fact. For the first time, Victor felt something unexpected creeping in. Doubt. And he didn't like it one bit. Chapter 3. The Millionaire's Ego versus the Man Who Didn't Care. Victor couldn't shake it. That last line. Or they know something you don't. What the hell was that supposed to mean? It wasn't just an answer, it was a challenge. A quiet, effortless checkmate. And Victor hated it. People didn't talk to him like that. They didn't look at him like that. Like he was missing something. Victor adjusted his Rolex, leaned back in his first-class seat, and exhaled sharply. Fine. If this guy wanted to play it cool, Victor would turn up the heat. So, Victor said, stretching his legs out, making himself bigger, like he was claiming space. If you don't care about money, what do you care about? Keanu glanced at him, like he could already see where this was going. A lot of things. Victor smirked. That's not an answer. Keanu shrugged. Neither was your question. Victor chuckled. All right. Let's cut through the Zen Master Act for a second. Let's say your bank account mysteriously vanished tomorrow. No credit cards, no savings, no safety net. Just you, some pocket change, and the real world. You still keeping that whole money doesn't define me energy? Keanu didn't even hesitate. Yeah. Victor scoffed. Come on, man. Be real. You can say that now because you have money. It's easy to pretend you're above it when you know it's always there. Keanu tilted his head slightly. You think money's what makes people who they are? Victor blinked, thrown off by the question. Of course it does. Money is freedom. It's power. It's the difference between being in control and being controlled. Keanu nodded, considering. And you think that control makes you better? Victor grinned. I know it does. Keanu didn't react. Didn't get defensive. He just took a slow sip of his water, like he'd heard this all before. Victor narrowed his eyes. You don't believe me? Keanu set his glass down. I think you believe it. That was worse. That was way worse. Because it wasn't an argument. It was a dismissal. Victor laughed, but there was an edge to it now. So, what? You're saying I don't have control? Keanu gave a small, knowing smile. I think you need to have control. Victor felt something tighten in his chest. Keanu didn't say it like an insult. He said it like a fact. Like he had just figured Victor out. Victor clenched his jaw, forcing another laugh. Man, you really got that whole mystical wise guy thing down, huh? What? You spend a few months in a monastery or something. Keanu chuckled. No monastery. Just a lot of time around different kinds of people. Victor smirked. Oh, I see. You're one of those guys. I travel the world and learn deep, spiritual truths from regular people type, right? Keanu shook his head. Not really. Victor tapped his fingers against the armrest. All right, then let's get real. I worked damn hard to get where I am. I built my success from the ground up. I earned this seat. People like me don't get handouts. We grind. We hustle. And when we make it, we show it. Because that's the point. Keanu nodded slowly. And yet, you don't look happy. Victor blinked. What? Keanu's expression didn't change. You don't look happy. Victor let out a sharp laugh. What? You some kind of therapist now? Keanu just looked at him, quiet. Steady. Victor scoffed. Dude, I love my life. I have everything I've ever wanted. Money. Power. The best of everything. He gestured around the cabin. Look where I'm sitting. You think unhappy people sit in seats like this? Keanu didn't break eye contact. Yeah, I do. Victor felt something crack in his chest. Just a tiny bit. He pushed it down. Hard. Look, man, he said, his voice a little tighter now. If you want to pretend that money doesn't matter, that's fine. But let's not kid ourselves. People who have money don't sit around talking about how it's not important. They just live. Keanu nodded. Then why are we talking about it? Victor opened his mouth, then stopped. He didn't have an answer for that. And that pissed him off more than anything else. Chapter 4. When Arrogance Meets Its Match. Victor shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers against the armrest. He didn't like this. This wasn't how conversations with people like him went. Normally, by now, the other guy would be nodding, agreeing, maybe even impressed by Victor's success, throwing out the usual lines, "Man, that's inspiring. I wish I had your drive. What's your secret?" But this guy? This guy just sat there, calm, like Victor's words meant nothing. Victor wasn't used to being ignored. "So, let me get this straight," Victor said, forcing a chuckle. "You're sitting in first class, drinking water, dressed like you just rolled out of bed, and you want me to believe that money doesn't mean anything to you?" Keanu nodded. "That about sums it up." Victor smirked, shaking his head. "Man, you gotta be messing with me." Keanu's expression didn't change. Victor exhaled through his nose. "All right, fine. Let's play this game. Let's pretend for a second that you actually believe all this Zen master, money doesn't define me stuff. You're telling me that if someone walked up to you right now and handed you 10 million bucks, you wouldn't change a thing?" Keanu shrugged. "Probably not." Victor blinked. "Bullsh," he caught himself, lowering his voice as a flight attendant passed by. "Bullshit. Nobody turns down $10 million. Keanu tilted his head. "Who said I'd turn it down?" Victor frowned. "What?" Keanu leaned back in his seat. "I'd take it, but it wouldn't change me." Victor laughed. "Oh, come on. You wouldn't upgrade your house? Buy a better car? Maybe, I don't know, ditch the sneakers that look like they've been through a war." Keanu smirked. "Probably not." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Dude, that's not normal." Keanu just shrugged. Victor scoffed, shaking his head. "All right, man. I gotta ask. You ever actually been broke?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah." Victor leaned in. "And you didn't hate it?" Keanu exhaled through his nose, thinking. "I didn't love it. But I wasn't miserable." Victor laughed again, but there was a sharpness to it now. "Man, you're something else. You really want me to believe that having no money is just as good as having a lot of it?" Keanu looked at him, patient as ever. "Depends on what you think money's supposed to do for you." Victor threw up his hands. "It's supposed to make life better. It gives you options. Comfort. Freedom. You ever see a rich guy waiting for the bus? No, because he doesn't have to. You ever see a billionaire stressing about rent? No, because he owns the damn building. Money takes problems off the table. And anyone who says different? They're just lying to themselves." Keanu nodded. "You're right about one thing." Victor smirked. "Damn right, I am." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Money takes some problems off the table, but it doesn't stop people from making new ones." Victor opened his mouth, then hesitated. Keanu continued. "You know how many rich people I've met who are miserable? Guys with more money than they could ever spend, who can't sleep at night, who push people away because they're afraid everyone's after their wealth, who feel trapped in their own success." Victor's smirk faded. Keanu's voice was steady, measured. "Money's a tool. It can buy comfort. It can buy security. But it can't buy peace. And it definitely can't buy who you are when everything else is stripped away." Victor swallowed, suddenly feeling seen in a way he didn't like. Keanu leaned back again, picking up his glass. "And that's the part most people don't want to hear." Victor forced out a laugh. "Man, you talk like you've got this whole life thing figured out." Keanu gave a small smile. "Nah, just been around long enough to know that not everything people chase is worth catching." Victor stared at him, something burning in his chest, something he didn't have a name for. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was winning. Chapter 5, the moment everything flipped. Victor could feel it now, the eyes. Passengers were starting to notice. Not the whole cabin, not yet, but the ones close enough to catch bits of the conversation. A businessman across the aisle gave a side glance over his tablet. A woman too rose up, subtly pulled out an AirPod, pretending to adjust it. People could feel tension, even when they weren't trying to. Victor wasn't an idiot. He knew how to read a room. And right now, he was the one looking bad. How the hell did that happen? He wasn't the jerk here. He was just making a point. He was right. This guy, this weirdly calm, frustratingly unbothered guy, was just playing the role of the humble, philosophical mystery man. Like some character out of a movie. And yet, for the first time in his life, Victor was starting to feel like he was losing an argument that should have been his from the start. Unacceptable. "So what's your secret, then?" Victor asked, forcing a smirk, like he was in control again. "What do you know that the rest of us don't?" Keanu took a slow sip of his water, then set the glass down carefully, like he had all the time in the world. "It's not about knowing something," he said. "It's about what you stop believing." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, this should be good. Enlighten me." Keanu leaned back. People spend their whole lives chasing things they think will make them somebody. Money, status, validation. They climb, they grind, they sacrifice. And then, when they finally get to the top of that mountain, you know what they find. Victor smirked. More mountains. Keanu gave a small nod. And a lot of them realized they weren't climbing for themselves. They were climbing because they thought they had to. Victor scoffed. So, what? You're saying ambition is bad? Keanu shook his head. I'm saying it's dangerous when you don't know why you're doing it. Victor exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. Man, you're acting like people just wake up one day and realize everything they've worked for doesn't matter. That's not how it works. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? Victor hesitated. Keanu didn't press. He just let the silence sit there. Like he knew Victor would be the one to break it first. And he was right. You think I don't know what I want? Victor said, voice a little sharper now. You think I don't wake up every day knowing exactly why I work my ass off? Why I built what I built? Keanu's expression stayed unreadable. Then why are you arguing with a guy drinking water in first class? Victor's jaw clenched. And then, a chuckle. Not from Keanu. From someone else. Victor turned his head just in time to see a guy across the aisle, mid-40s, suit, expensive watch, hide a grin behind his hand. Oh, hell no. Now people were laughing at him? Victor forced out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. All right, man. You got your little audience now. I see what's happening here. He gestured vaguely around them. Go ahead. Play the wise man. Drop another fortune cookie line. I'm sure everyone's dying to hear it. Keanu sighed, like he wasn't enjoying this any more than Victor was. Man, this isn't a competition. Victor laughed. Says the guy who just put on a show for half the cabin. Keanu shook his head. Nobody's watching because of me, Victor. Victor frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Keanu met his gaze. They're watching because you're fighting. Victor felt something tighten in his chest. Keanu kept going. You're not arguing with me, man. You're arguing with yourself. You're just using me as a mirror. Victor exhaled sharply. Oh, give me a break. Keanu's voice stayed level. You want to win. But the problem is, you're not sure what you're trying to win. Victor clenched his jaw. Something about that sentence hit him in a way he didn't like. Man, I don't even know what you're talking about anymore, Victor said, shaking his head, grabbing his champagne and taking a long sip, mostly just to do something. Keanu nodded. Yeah, that's the problem. And the worst part? Victor didn't have a damn thing to say back. Chapter 6, The Punch He Never Saw Coming. Victor had spent his life mastering control. Over deals, over people, over situations. It was how he built his empire. He saw people as chess pieces, predictable, easy to maneuver. But this guy? This guy was a broken algorithm, a glitch in the system. And Victor hated glitches. He adjusted his cufflinks, took another sip of champagne, and exhaled slowly. He wasn't about to let some random dude unravel him. So let me get this straight, Victor said, putting his glass down. You think I'm just, what? Running in circles? Chasing some illusion? Keanu gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Not my place to say. Victor scoffed. Oh, come on. You've been playing armchair psychologist for the last 15 minutes. You might as well commit. Keanu tilted his head slightly. All right, he said. I think a lot of people spend their whole lives trying to prove something. Victor smirked. And you don't. Keanu shook his head. Not anymore. Victor let out a short laugh. Oh, so you used to be like us, huh? Chasing money, chasing status? Keanu considered that for a moment. I used to chase certainty. Victor frowned. What does that even mean? Keanu sighed, leaning back in his seat. It means I wanted to know that if I worked hard enough, if I earned enough, if I became enough, then life would make sense. That there'd be some moment where everything just clicked. Victor raised an eyebrow. And Keanu looked at him. And then I realized that moment never comes. For a second, Victor didn't respond. Because deep down, in a place he didn't want to admit existed, something about that felt familiar. So what? He said, shaking it off. You just gave up? Keanu chuckled. No. I just stopped needing the finish line. Victor rolled his eyes. Man, I hate this mystical, guru talk. Keanu smirked. I'm not a guru. Yeah, no kidding. Gurus charge people for this kind of nonsense. Victor took another sip of his drink. Look, man, you can dress this up however you want, but the truth is, people need to prove themselves. You think Steve Jobs built Apple by just being at peace? Keanu shook his head. No. He built it by wanting more. And that's not a bad thing. Victor pointed at him. Exactly. Keanu continued. But what happens when more is never enough? Victor hesitated. Keanu kept going. There's always a bigger deal. A nicer car. A higher number. And if that's what fuels you, then what happens when you finally hit the number you thought would make you happy, and nothing changes? Victor smirked, but it felt a little forced now. Then you go higher. Keanu nodded. And how high is high enough? Victor didn't answer. Keanu's voice softened. That's the part nobody talks about, man. When you're climbing a ladder that doesn't end, you don't get to win. You just get tired. Victor clenched his jaw, but there was something off about the way his body reacted. Like the words had hit somewhere deeper than they should have. He straightened his tie, forced a smirk. You sound like a guy who hit the top and didn't like the view. Keanu exhaled through his nose. I just think a lot of people spend their whole lives running towards something they don't actually want. Victor laughed. Oh yeah? And what I want then? Keanu didn't answer right away. He studied Victor, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, Victor felt seen. Not as a billionaire, not as a power player, but as something else. You tell me, Keanu said quietly. Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And that was the punch he never saw coming. Chapter 7. The moment his world crumbled. Victor had built his life on answers. He had them for everything: business, success, power. Ask him how to close a deal, how to flip a market downturn, how to turn 10 million into 100, and he'd give you a masterclass before you finished your drink. But this was different. Keanu's words hung in the air like an unanswered question Victor didn't want to hear. You tell me. Victor opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but nothing. No quick retort, no witty comeback. His brain felt like an engine revving but going nowhere. He let out a sharp breath, masking the silence with a chuckle. Man, you really got this whole philosophical drifter thing down, huh? Keanu just watched him. Not smug, not victorious, just watching. And for the first time in his life, Victor felt like he was the one being studied. No, screw that. He wasn't about to let this nobody flip the script on him. Victor squared his shoulders, putting the power back in his voice. Look, man, I get what you're trying to do. You want me to have some big aha moment, realize I've been chasing the wrong things, maybe even shake my hand at the end like I just unlocked some deep life truth. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if considering the idea. That's up to you. Victor laughed, but it didn't feel like his usual laugh. It felt off. Hollow. Yeah, well, hate to break it to you, but I'm good, man. I like my life. I like knowing I've worked harder than 99% of people out there. You think I'm supposed to feel bad about that? Keanu shook his head. No, just wondering if you feel anything about it. Victor's grip tightened on his glass. His heart was beating faster, but he had no idea why. The silence stretched. And then, a voice cut through the cabin. Excuse me, sir. Victor turned, already irritated. A flight attendant stood beside him, hands clasped in that perfectly professional way. She wasn't looking at him, though. She was looking at Keanu. I just wanted to let you know, she said, a bit of excitement slipping into her voice. The captain wanted me to pass along that he's a huge fan. He said if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. Victor froze. The world shifted, tilted. Keanu just smiled, nodded. That's really kind. Tell him I said thanks. The flight attendant beamed. Of course. Then, with one last glance of admiration, she walked off. Victor's mind was scrambling, putting pieces together at lightning speed, but the picture still didn't make sense. Fan? Captain? His throat felt dry. He licked his lips. Wait a second. Keanu turned back to him, that same relaxed energy, like nothing had changed. Victor stared at him now. Really stared. Dark hair. Strong jawline. That voice. Oh, shit. His brain finally caught up. His heart punched the inside of his ribs. No way, Victor whispered, barely breathing. No way. Keanu said nothing. Just let him get there on his own. Victor swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry. You're Keanu Reeves. A small, almost amused smile. That's what my passport says. Victor's stomach flipped. The past 20 minutes replayed in his head like a car crash he couldn't stop. The comments. The condescension. The not-so-subtle jabs. And the whole time, he had been talking down to one of the most beloved men on the planet. He'd flushed his face. He couldn't tell if it was anger, humiliation, or both. Keanu just watched him. Calm as ever. Victor let out a breathy laugh, running a hand down his face. Holy shit. Keanu tilted his head. Something wrong? Victor shook his head, still processing. Man, I thought you were just some random guy. Keanu smiled. You did. Victor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus, no wonder you were so damn calm. You weren't just playing some wise man act. You were just being you. Keanu didn't reply. Victor slumped back in his seat, staring at the ceiling. I just spent 20 minutes trying to lecture Keanu Reeves about life. Keanu chuckled softly. Yeah, that happened. Victor covered his face with his hands for a second, groaning. Then, with a forced laugh, he dropped them. Dude, why didn't you say something? Keanu shrugged. You never asked. Victor blinked. Then, against all logic, he laughed. A real laugh this time. The kind that came from deep in his chest. The kind he hadn't felt in a while. He looked over at Keanu, still shaking his head. Man, I was really out here trying to school you on success. Keanu grinned. You were. Victor ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. Keanu smirked. Or maybe just funny. Victor let out another breath, finally feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. All right, I'll give you that. A beat passed. Then Victor turned to him again, eyes sharp. But for the record, I still think money matters. Keanu nodded. Probably. Victor narrowed his eyes. That's all you're going to say? Keanu took another sip of his water, set it down, and smiled. Yep. Victor let out another laugh, shaking his head. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he was right. And that scared him more than anything. Chapter 8. The lesson he never saw coming. Victor sat there, staring at Keanu like the universe had just played the ultimate joke on him. He'd spent the entire flight trying to prove a point. To who, exactly? To himself? To a man who clearly didn't need convincing? And now, after all that, he was left with nothing but the realization that he'd been completely out of his depth the entire time. He rubbed a hand down his face, exhaling. Man, this is unreal. Keanu just smiled, as if this sort of thing happened to him all the time. Maybe it did. Maybe people underestimated him because he didn't act rich, because he didn't wear his success like a badge of honor. Victor had never met anyone like that before, and he didn't know what to do with it. The plane hummed softly as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, preparing for descent. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing their estimated arrival time. Victor drummed his fingers against the armrest, his mind a tangle of thoughts. So, he said finally, glancing at Keanu. I guess this is the part where I have some big realization, right? Where I admit you were right, and I was wrong, and I walk off this plane a changed man. Keanu chuckled. I don't think it works like that. Victor smirked. Yeah, didn't think so. He let out a breath, shaking his head. But, for what it's worth. He hesitated. He wasn't great at this part. I might have been a little. I don't know. Arrogant. Keanu gave him a knowing look. A little. Victor laughed. All right. A lot. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't usually do the whole self-reflection thing. Keanu nodded. Not many people do. Victor sighed, staring out the window as the city lights below came into view. You know, I spent years thinking that success was about winning. Being the guy who had more. More money, more power, more everything. I told myself that if I could just keep climbing, keep owning the game, I'd get to some point where it all felt worth it. Keanu didn't interrupt. Just listened. Victor ran a hand through his hair. But now I'm sitting here, drinking overpriced champagne next to Keanu freaking Reeves, and for the first time, I'm wondering if maybe I've been climbing the wrong damn mountain. Keanu took a sip of his water. There are worse things than realizing that early. Victor chuckled, shaking his head. Man, I don't know if I'd call 38 early. Keanu smirked. Beats 80. Victor laughed at that. Fair. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Victor exhaled and turned to him again. All right. Give me one last piece of wisdom before we land. Something I can actually use. Keanu thought for a moment, then said, You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Victor. Not even yourself. Victor stared at him. He had no comeback for that. The plane touched down smoothly, rolling to a stop on the tarmac. Passengers around them started stretching, reaching for their bags, preparing to leave. Victor grabbed his suit jacket, then hesitated. Hey, He glanced at Keanu. You ever regret it? Keanu raised an eyebrow. Regret what? Not playing the game. Not cashing in on who you are. You could be doing, I don't know, sponsorships, branding deals, turning yourself into a massive empire. But you just. Victor gestured vaguely. You just are. Keanu smiled. And that's enough. Victor didn't respond right away, because for the first time, he actually believed him. As they stepped off the plane, Keanu blended into the crowd with the same quiet ease he'd carried the entire flight. No fanfare, no entourage, just a man who knew exactly who he was. And Victor? For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure who he was trying to be anymore. The moment that changed everything. Victor Harding walked onto that plane thinking he was untouchable, rich, powerful, the kind of man who owned every room he walked into. But in just a few hours, he got a lesson in humility from the last person he ever expected. Keanu Reeves didn't have to prove anything. He didn't need the flash, the ego, the game. And that's what shook Victor the most. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't winning. He was learning. And as he stepped off that plane, one question echoed in his mind. What if I've been chasing the wrong thing all along? If this story made you think, imagine what's coming next. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and turn on that bell so you never miss another story that'll leave you questioning everything.